I'm John Culp, and this is my restoration story. When I was a child growing up, I was in church every Sunday. Jesus was just very real to me. I'd talk to him like he was just my friend who was always with me, and come to think of it, he really was. However, as I grew into adolescence, I began to question my faith, and the biggest part of that is that I'm a pretty scientifically minded guy, and I had read and come to accept a lot of the ideas that science and religion are opposed to each other. When I went off to medical school, I spent a lot of time by myself, and I got to be lonely and depressed, and I felt like something was missing in my life. I had a pretty good idea of what it was, and I'd get out the Bible and try to read it and hope that I'd read something that would just convince me that it was valid. What ended up happening is I saw people in my medical practice. I saw a big difference between people who had a strong faith and people who had none when they're faced with the real trials of life. And you know, I wanted what those people with faith had. I had a patient who had had a bad heart attack, and he was left with pretty serious damage to his heart that caused heart failure. One day, I was at the hospital making rounds. I was in the intensive care unit, and I saw the EMS crew wheeling a fellow in, and they were coding him. And I recognized that the fellow on the gurney was my patient who had previously had the heart attack. He'd had another one. He wasn't admitted to me, but I took over and got him settled on a ventilator in the ICU, got everything going. He was admitted to a cardiologist. And I went out to talk to his family and learned that they had two beautiful little boys who were about ages 3 and 5. As it went along, I had done an exam on this fellow right after he came in, and clinically it looked like he was brain dead. I went home just feeling absolutely terrible that day after he'd flatlined. And I did something that I hadn't done in many years. I prayed. And I said, God, I don't know if you're even there to hear me, but if you are, I want to ask you to do something. I don't want anything for myself, but could you please heal that man so that he can take care of his family, his children? And you know what? A feeling of peace came over me, and I went to sleep. And I woke up the next morning remembering that, and I thought something really special happened last night. I wonder what's going to happen today. I went up to the hospital to make my rounds, and the first place I went was to the ICU to see this man. I looked down at him and I said, poor Mr. So-and-so. All of a sudden his eyes popped wide open, staring straight into my eyes. I felt like I had been shocked from my head down to my toes. He was looking at me and trying to talk with that tube in his throat, and couldn't, of course. The EEG tech dropped her bottle of electrode gel, ran out of the room yelling for the nurses to come here quickly. They called the other doctors, and they were amazed. Neither one of them were Christian believers, but they both said, this is a miracle. I can't explain it any other way. And by the next day, they had him moved out of the ICU to the step-down unit, and pretty quickly, he got well enough to go home. One day, I was back at the hospital, and the cardiologist reminded me of that fellow, and he said, I just want to let you know, he's had some congestive heart failure come back, and he's just very depressed and despondent. I'm afraid he's not going to make it. And so I said, I'll talk to him, and said, how are you doing? And he said, Doc, I'm just having such a hard time. I just wish I could go on and die. And I told him, you know what? You really did die about 3 months ago. But here you are. God brought you back. And if he's got you here, he's got a plan for you. And if I were you, I'd try to find out what that is. The next day, the cardiologist said, I don't know what you said to him, but he's just completely turned the corner, and I'm going to send him home today. As I was getting ready to move up here to take my present position, I was rounding in the other hospital in town. Someone said, "Hey Doc, how you doing?" I looked up and it was that man, dressed up in his nicest clothes, come to try to cheer up and encourage a friend of his who was in the hospital. It shouldn't have taken a miracle like that to get me to come to faith in Christ, but sometimes, somebody's stubborn as a mule and you just gotta kind of whack them over the head to get their attention. I think that's what God did.